everybody. Welcome and thank you for coming. I am Jim Ruebel. I'm the Dean of the Honors College at Ball State University. The Bruce F. and Ildiko B. Meyer Honors Memorial Lecture is presented in honor of the memory of Professor Bruce Meyer and his wife, Ildiko. Bruce Meyer was a professor of architecture. He had joined the Ball State University faculty in 1973, where he eventually became assistant to the dean in the College of Architecture and Planning, and went on to become the Dean of the Honors College in 1996, a position he held till his untimely death in 1998. Ildiko Meyer, his wife, first conceived and initiated the plans for a lasting memorial to Bruce Meyer, plans that were temporarily delayed when Ildiko also died unexpectedly in 1999. Ildiko had graduated summa cum laude from the University of Utah and received a master's degree in psychology from Ball State. In Indiana, she had been a school psychologist for Newcastle and Muncie Community Schools. The Meyer family, especially Bruce's brother Jim and Jim's wife Sandy, determined that they wanted this memorial to be honors-related, had to have wide impact on campus. And they have generously brought us to this point, the 10th Bruce F. and Ildiko B. Meyer Honors Memorial Lecture. The Meyer Lectures are selected from a broad range of disciplines reflecting Bruce's role as Dean of the Honors College and civically engaged architecture professor. We have had presentations by a wide range of faculty from other institutions, by a Deputy Provost for the Arts, and by actors. This year, the Meyer Lecture will be given by Shari Lieberman-Mintz, who is Curator of Graphics at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, and Senior Consultant on Judaica et Societas. Her lecture is entitled Celebrating Marriage in Jewish Art, Medieval and Early Modern Perspectives. And at this time, I will introduce Frank Felsenstein, who will give you a full introduction.
Thank you so much, Jim. And I want to begin by apologizing that everybody had to wait the hour. I think we're extremely lucky to have Sharon Lieberman-Mintz visiting us in a very, very tight schedule that she has. We first got to know each other in the, I think, early 1990s, and then cooperated together on an exhibition in New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which produced a catalogue, The Jew as Other. What I didn't realize was that this was pretty well the first of many catalogues that Sharon has produced, either exhibition catalogues. She has just, 24 hours ago, 36 hours ago, she was in Berlin, Germany, not Berlin, Indiana, in order to open a major exhibition of the Brzezinski collection. She's been in the Midwest a couple of times in the last month or so for another exhibition which is in Columbus, Ohio. She just got back, as I say, from Europe, and agreed very generously to come here. Later this week, she's off to Italy. So I think between Berlin and Rome, Muncie, Indiana stands very high, I hope. And it gives me the greatest pleasure, without wishing to say any more, at this stage, to welcome you, Sharon, for the talk on celebrating marriage in Jewish art, medieval and early modern perspectives.
Thank you so much. I think I'm mic'd. Am I mic'd? Do I have to hold this or no? Okay, good. Even better. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as some of you may remember, I was tried to come here in March and was snowed out. They canceled all the planes, and so we tried again today. And a storm came by, and I feel like for the airport's benefit, I probably shouldn't try to come to the Midwest again anytime soon. Threw a lot of travelers off today, but I'm glad. It's my first time in Muncie and in Indiana generally, and it's thank you all for coming and especially for staying. One last thank yous to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Frank Felsenstein, who we've worked with for many years together, and I hope we'll continue to do so, and to Dr. James Ruebel for inviting me here, and Mr. John Straw, and all the other people who were involved in my coming. And I do think that we should probably dim some of the lights because the stuff will look much better on the screen if we do. That's fine. And yeah, much better. All right, and we begin. In 1403, Rabbi Profet Duran, a Jewish scholar and physician living in Spain, wrote revealingly in his best-known work, a grammatical treatise entitled Maaseh Ephod, as follows. One should study from beautiful books, written in harmonious script, on fine parchment with luxurious bindings, since the contemplation of beautiful forms with delicate images and fine drawings pleases the soul, stimulates the mind, and strengthens the powers. And he further noted, it has been one of the virtues of our nation, meaning the Jews, that the rich and important in every generation have exerted every effort to produce beautiful books. Despite this powerful statement, and with a surprisingly casual disregard for the evidence that lay in plain sight on the bookshelves of public libraries and private collections across Europe, until the 20th century, academics promulgated the popular misconception that Jews eschewed the visual arts. This idea was purportedly based on the text of the Second Commandment, which is found in the biblical book of Exodus, chapter 20, verse 4. The text of the Second Commandment reads as follows. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or in the earth below. However, this commandment has actually been interpreted by the rabbis as a prohibition against idolatry rather than a prohibition against visual imagery. And the rabbis connected it to the biblical phrase which directly follows it. You shall not bow down to them nor worship them. A discussion in the Talmud, the massive compendium of Jewish law, which was completed around the year 500 of the Common Era, makes it clear that the rabbis were primarily concerned with idol worship and therefore distinguished between three-dimensional art, which they more or less forbade, such as sculpture, and two-dimensional art, such as painting, which they permitted in principle, with a few exceptions, which we'll come to later. The rabbis cautioned against the worship of images, not against the images themselves. Thus we find numerous Hebrew manuscripts from the 10th century onwards replete with decorative designs and illustrations. Tonight we're going to explore the celebration of Jewish marriage as seen through two genres of Hebrew manuscripts. The first, illustrations depicting Jewish weddings from a selection of Hebrew manuscripts, illuminated and decorated illustrated manuscripts. And the second, Jewish weddings as documented through the creation of sumptuous Jewish marriage contracts known in Hebrew as ketubbot. The celebration of Jewish marriage in the medieval and Renaissance period is visually recorded in 11 Hebrew manuscripts created in northern Italy during the second half of the 15th century. The highlight of the wedding, the betrothal scene, is the primary image represented. And what is interesting is that while one might expect wedding imagery to appear exclusively in books of prayer as an accompaniment to the wedding blessings, this is not the case. A review of these 11 manuscripts reveals that a third of the images are found in legal texts. And now I'd like to look more closely at several representative examples as found in both prayer books and legal texts. And this is a manuscript. It's a small compendium of prayers related to life cycle events, and included are prayers for circumcision and marriage, as well as prayers for mourners. And it was created in northern Italy around the year 1475. It's not specifically dated, but it's datable via the art and other textual references. Here, illustrating the text relating to marriage at left is a lavish depiction of the bride and groom at the moment of betrothal as the groom places a ring on the bride's index finger. And here you see a close-up of that image. Although it's traditional in Jewish custom to place the ring on the bride's right hand, in this image, the groom puts it on her left hand. And this is not necessarily artistic license because we do find a suggestion in the rabbinic literature that if the bride is left-handed, the ring should be placed on her left hand. It's not done nowadays, but apparently there was reference to that in the past. The bride and the groom are richly dressed. The bride wears a horned headdress, very chic at the time, a light veil, and a pleated full-skirted gown with sleeves of different material, which is a fashion that originated in Ferrara, where this manuscript is probably from. The groom wears a short cloak, cinched with a gold belt, and a jerkin and hose, and the sumptuous clothing signifies the substantial wealth of the couple. Beautifully penned and illustrated books of prayer were frequently given as wedding gifts among wealthy Italian Jewish families, and it is not out of the question that the image seen here is an actual portrait of the bride and groom created in celebration of this special occasion. Going back to the page earlier, I just want to point out that the floral border that enframes the two pages includes a half-length figure of a man on either side, and the one at right actually holds a book. You can see that up there. See, he's got a book in his hand. And it's perhaps even this very book that was presented to the bride and groom. The two figures may also have been intended to serve as witnesses to the ceremony, as traditional Jewish weddings include two witnesses. That's standard in order to validate the marriage. The next manuscript is an absolutely outstanding work of Italian Renaissance art. It's a prayer book known as a Machzor, which contains the entire cycle of Jewish prayers for the year. Machzor actually literally means a cycle. Nowadays, people come to synagogues and they say, may I have a machzor? It's sort of become the name of a prayer book, but it means cycle. And this particular book is written in 2 volumes, and it was completed in 1481 in the northern central sort of Italian town of Pesaro. And the work is replete with illustrations of Jewish festivals and holidays, and includes images that accompany the prayers for the life cycle events, again, such as circumcision and marriage. In the image that we see here again is the betrothal ceremony, and it accompanies prayers relating to the wedding. And in front of 2 witnesses, as you see here again, a rabbi assists the colorfully dressed groom to put a ring on the bride's extended right index finger. Now, it's important to note for this that traditional Jewish weddings consist of 2 ceremonies: betrothal, which is known as Hebrew as kiddushin, and nuptials, which is known in Hebrew as nisuin. And during the first ceremony of betrothal, a ring or another object of value is given to the bride, and 2 blessings are recited, and the groom presents a bride with a ketubbot, a marriage contract, which is a legal document that states the obligation of the groom to the bride in the event of divorce or if he predeceases her. It also explains the obligations of the groom to the bride during the marriage as well. And during the second ceremony of nisuin, or nuptials, the couple is brought under a chuppah, a wedding canopy, and 7 benedictions are recited. And the following page in this manuscript depicts the groom presenting a ketubbah to the bride in front of 2 witnesses. And here you see a close-up of that. And we're going to discuss this ketubbah, this marriage contract, in greater detail further on. But for the purposes of this image, you see that she's holding a rolled-up scroll in her hand, because these documents, which are often quite large, they could be as large as 3 feet high and 2 feet across, were then kept by the bride in rolled-up form. Nowadays, some of you may know that ketubbot are commissioned. They're considered sort of important works of art for the couple, sometimes the first work of art that they've commissioned together, and they're generally hung and framed on the wall. But that's a phenomena that's current only since the 70s, when we have the revival of the art of Hebrew marriage contracts. In those days, they were rolled up, as you see here, and handed to the bride. And it's interesting that both of these examples that we've seen from prayer books show the moment of betrothal as a private moment. It's not a public celebration, but it's something private between the bride and the groom that's witnessed by 2 witnesses, as you see here, but not large crowds. And in contrast to that, I'd like to look at 2 examples of wedding images as found in legal texts. On the screen here is an image from a magnificently illustrated 15th century manuscript known as an Arbat Turim. Arbat Turim literally means the 4 pillars. And this is a comprehensive legal code that was written in Spain the code itself, that is, the Arbaturim, this book is later, by Jacob ben Asher in the middle of the 14th century, about circa 1350. And it was an extremely popular code of Jewish law, and it was copied frequently in the 14th and 15th centuries. And what you're looking at here is a book that was written in Mantua and dated 1435, exactly. And the book, the Arbaturim, the Four Pillars, is, as you might imagine, divided into 4 sections, and each deals with a different aspect of Jewish law. And most copies lack any decoration, and in fact, comparatively few Hebrew manuscripts, or excuse me, comparatively few Hebrew legal texts contain decoration. They were considered working documents, and it's not something that patrons spent a lot of money embellishing with any kind of illustration. So we're looking at something that's the exception to the rule for a legal text. So in this manuscript, each of the 4 sections features a lavishly illustrated opening page which introduces the topic. And this manuscript is decorated in the contemporary Gothic International style that was prevalent in Lombardy at the time. And the image that we see here is the first page to the 3rd section of the Arbaturim, the 4 pillars, and that section is called Even HaEzer, which means the helping stone, and it actually discusses the laws governing marriage and family life. And as such, it opens with an image of a wedding. And Hebrew manuscripts commissioned by wealthy Italian Jewish patrons were written by Jewish scribes, but often illuminated by local Christian workshops. And this is because the Jews at this period in Italy, in the medieval and Renaissance period, were not allowed into the guilds or the art academies, and therefore did not have access to the information of how to create pigments, how to lay down gilding. And we find often these beautifully penned manuscripts were done by the important workshops in town. So this is an example of something that was probably produced in a master workshop in Renaissance Italy. And it features notably realistic miniature illustrations. And on the left, you see a rabbi officiating as the groom places a ring on the bride's finger. And the celebrants are wearing extravagant headgear and luxuriant garments that are embroidered and embellished with gold thread and trimmed in fern. You can sort of see the gold here. I mean, this is really sumptuous clothing that they're wearing. The scene at right has not been precisely identified over here, but it appears to be the newly married couple as they enter the banquet hall to the sound of heralding trumpets behind them. This is another example, one of the few other known illustrated copies of this same legal text, the Arbaturim. And again, we're looking at the opening page to the 3rd volume, Even HaEzer, and as it deals with the laws of Jewish marriage, we see here the opening text appears in the unfurled banners held up by 2 chubby and quite naked putti. I'll have a close-up of that, I think, in a minute. But I wanted you to get a sense of the full page. And what you see are the words at top, Lo Tov. It is not good, which are funny opening words, but actually if you understood the reference, which I'll explain in a minute, it makes sense, because the reference is to the verse in Genesis where God talks about Lo Tov Heyot Adam Levado, it is not good that man be alone, let us therefore create a helpmeet for him. And so the legal text opens up the discussions of marriage, pointing out that even God thought that this was something important to be taken care of. And here, in fact, you can see that the putti are quite naked, stark naked, with all the full appurtenances. And they're here in the middle of the page of a very serious legal text. And it's kind of interesting that the Jews of this period are clearly quite comfortable with all the contemporary artistic Italian imagery. And we find this to be true of all the other books that are being created in Italy at this time. The Jews were very comfortable adapting and adopting the art of the host country in which they lived. In this case, the artwork was probably produced by the Christian workshop in town. Nevertheless, this text was used and enjoyed, and you don't see anything scratched off. I mean, maybe the gold is flaked, but that's a matter of age. So over here, what we're looking at is an image of the wedding party. It starts off lo tov heyot adam levado. It's not good for man to be alone. And so what we see is a whole group of the wedding party, the bride and groom at center, here. We're not seeing the actual moment of betrothal, the parents perhaps next to them, and they're being serenaded. And indeed, they are not alone. There's quite a crowd over here. And what I wanted to point out is it's interesting that the prayer books from this period tend to depict a more private and individual perspective on the Jewish wedding ceremony, whereas the legal texts, whose function it is to lay out the laws that govern the boundaries of Jewish communal life, present a more collective representation of the Jewish marriage ceremony. So, although both manuscripts, both the prayer books and the books, these legal codes, were commissioned and owned privately, it's not like one was owned by a public institution, such as a synagogue. They were both private commissions of wealthy Italian Jews who could afford the luxury of commissioning a scribe to write a handwritten text. The book that sort of reflects a private experience, the prayer book, shows the individual couple, and the book that reflects sort of communal law, the legal text, shows much more of a public face of marriage. Books as luxury objects require a certain amount of communal stability and personal wealth, really, to produce. And this is true of the next group of objects we're going to explore, which is decorated Jewish marriage contracts. And I'll just point out here, I know there was a little bit of a film with Barbara Wolf who was showing some of the techniques of manuscript production. It's just something to think about. At this period in Italy, manuscript production has moved out of monasteries and church workshops and moved into sort of the university sphere where manuscripts were being produced as a part of the books that the students needed. So you have this workshop production of manuscripts, generally speaking, for the Christian audience. But Hebrew books did not enjoy this kind of widespread patronage, so we don't have workshop production for Hebrew manuscripts. What we have instead are itinerant scribes that went town to town, and they would work, for a patron. The patron would have to house him, would have to pay him. This book actually, we know, took 10 months to write, which actually seems pretty short to me because it's several hundred pages. And maybe they gave it out to illuminate at a local Christian workshop, artistic workshop at the time that it was being written. So it's a different kind of manuscript production that's going on at the time, and you do have wealthy individuals commissioning these manuscripts specifically. It's not as if they're being done as a group or by an institution at this particular period. So we spoke of two parts of the Jewish wedding ceremony, and in ancient times, there used to be a space of several months between the first and the second ceremony. So you had betrothal first, and then maybe a year later, you would have the nuptials. But in the 11th century, an interval of several months to a year was deemed inconvenient. It didn't make sense for people to go and come back, and the two ceremonies began to be performed at the same time. And this is actually how it's done today still. To mark the end of one ceremony and the beginning of the second, the ketubbot, the marriage contract, was read out loud. And if you go to a traditional Jewish wedding today, you will see the first part of the ceremony, which is the ring and two benedictions. Then the marriage contract is read. It's in Aramaic, so it's kind of a formal reading because not many people in the audience always understand the Aramaic. And then you go on to the second part of the wedding ceremony. And what's going on here is that although all marriages contain a ketubbot, a marriage contract, as part of the ceremony, very wealthy families sought to distinguish their social status by lavishly decorating these contracts. And this very public occasion presented aristocratic and wealthy Jewish families with the perfect opportunity to kind of signal just where they stood in society, and presented with this opportunity, they took it. So it got to the point where Jews in Italy were spending so much money on marriage contracts that the rabbis actually slapped sumptuary laws on it. They said, you can only spend X amount of money on luxury goods. It was part of a general sort of overview of the Jewish community of how much money should be spent on feasts and on clothing, and how much jewelry you can wear, at what point in your life. Brides could wear more, new mothers could wear more. But these ketubbot, which you'll see momentarily, became part of that ruling. So, in addition to offering a fascinating look at the lives of individual couples, decorated and illustrated Jewish marriage contracts in the early modern era provide a plethora of information concerning the artistic creativity and the cultural interactions and the social history of the Jewish communities in which they were created. And tonight I'd like to look specifically at Italian marriage contracts, of which this is not one. This is the history that's going to lead up to it. But just a little bit by way of background. Ketubah comes from the Hebrew word ketab, which literally means to write. So it's a document that's written, and the plural is ketubbot. If I use it, it can be sort of interchangeable. And these are legal documents, and they pack an enormous amount of textual and visual information into one piece of paper. So not long after the two parts of the wedding ceremony were joined, through the public reading of a ketubah out loud, we find examples of decorated marriage contracts beginning to appear. And the earliest complete Jewish marriage contracts with simple ornamental borders are known to us from medieval Spain. We do have earlier undecorated documents from the 11th century, which have been found in the Cairo Geniza, but these have no real decorative borders surrounding them. They may have a few sort of little doodles above the letters, and even that, there may be two or three like that. Those are just plain text from the 11th century. The first time that we find full marriage contracts with a certain amount of decoration is in Spain, and you're looking at one of the earliest ones. And this was done in the town of Tudela in the year 1300. And we only have about a handful, maybe 25, 30, that have survived from medieval Spain. And the way that they survived was interesting. Most of them survived as having been reused in the bindings of books. They were sort of thrown out as scrap, or when the Jews left Spain and Portugal, more on that in a minute, the material was there. And parchment is quite durable, and these marriage contracts were written on parchment in Europe. And so, people figured, let's reuse them. And there's actually a phenomena right now going on where scholars are allowed to examine the bindings all throughout the small libraries in Italy and Spain, and finding all kinds of incredible Hebrew manuscripts. So this is one of the earliest contracts, and Tudela is a city in northern Spain in the Kingdom of Navarre. And what you see here is a very simple, repetitive, ornamental border of geometric patterns set very close to the text, with decorative birds on either upper corner. You see those up there? I'm sorry that I don't have a pointer. But they are pretty obvious. And this is, in fact, the only one of these sort of 25 or 30 early contracts with any kind of figural imagery. The rest of them are all strictly geometric or floral. And in the 14th century, we learn that the decoration also served a very important functional purpose. It prevented, what did it do? It prevented any of the families involved on these two sides of the contract from tampering with the text. Because actually these are significant financial contracts, a renowned rabbinic authority from the late 14th century, Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran, observed that the borders of ketubbot should be filled in with biblical verses and decorations so that no new stipulations could be added. In Hebrew, we have a phrase that says, ad kan v'lo yoter, up to here and no more. We've discussed it. Here's what we've promised one another. Here's what the husband is going to give the wife. And this is it. This is where it ends. So how do we get from these fairly modestly decorated documents to the very sumptuously ornamented ketubbot created in the 17th century. Well, in Hebrew, the Iberian Peninsula, which is where these first legal marriage contracts were decorated, where it first emerges, in Hebrew, the Iberian Peninsula is known as Sepharad. When the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, were expelled from Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1497, they settled first in Italy, in the Ottoman Empire, and in North Africa. And these Jews, who became known as Sephardim, those who emigrated from Sfarad, the Iberian Peninsula, maintained their customs and continued their traditions that we find, for example, of decorated ketubbot. And what happens is that in all of the major urban centers where these Sephardic Jews then emigrated, we find the beginnings of ketubbah decorations as well. Okay, so they took with them the earliest examples that were quite simple, and when they settled in other places, we begin to find this art form is emerging. And the very first community where we do find it emerging is in Venice. And those begin to emerge in about 1612, which is actually some years after the expulsion from Spain and Portugal. There are a few contracts sort of in the 16th century, but by the early 17th century is when we begin to see this this phenomena really flower. And what I'm showing you here actually is a marriage contract from Venice, but I've jumped ahead to the 18th century. And I chose this elaborate decorated contract because it's very representative of a contract by a member of the Sephardi community in Italy. And Italy had communities of Jews that had been in Italy for many years. Those are sort of Italian Jews. They had communities of Jews from the Ottoman Empire. They had communities of Jews from Ashkenaz, from the Franco-Germanic region. They had Jews from Spain and Portugal, Sephardi Jews. And for those of you who have visited the ghetto in Venice, for example, you'll find there are 5 different synagogues within, a 1 or 2 block radius. It's because each one of these communities maintain their customs and their prayer services and their communities forward. So what we're looking at here is a ketubbah from 1749 from Venice. And ketubbot contain a significant body of information. That's really nice because sometimes when you look at a work of art and you don't know anything about where or when it was made, you have to begin to put everything together and put it into context. The nicest thing about art historians working with ketubbot is that the very first sentence tells us where and when it's made. It's like it starts, B'shishi b'Shabbos, on Friday, and then it goes into the date. And then it tells you who it was made for and where it was made. And not only where it was made, but what rivers it was near. So you've got all of this information, and the families and the parents, and how much money is being paid, and the signatures of on Sephardi ketubbot of the groom, of the witnesses, the individuals who are involved in the contract. So there's quite a bit, and this is all standard. On this particular document, and on all of the ketubbot from the Sephardi community, there are 2 texts, actually. On the left-hand side, written in a semi-cursive script, which actually is a little hard to read here, I think I'll have a close-up, is the t'naim, the engagement contract. And on the right-hand side is the ketubbah, the wedding contract. And actually, they distinguish this visually, because if this slide was in a bit stronger, you would see that this is written in a square Hebrew script, and this is written in a semi-cursive, and here it's just sort of devolving into dots, but you'll have to take my word on that. So the engagement articles typically contain the dowry, as well as other special stipulations, and the marriage contract on the right is sort of the standard marriage contract, which, although I say it's a standard marriage contract, I should explain one other thing. There was a bifurcation in terms of how the Jewish community related to these contracts. In the early medieval period, in the Franco-Germanic region, the Jews of Ashkenaz, which is what this region is called, adopted a standard contract where the monies were standard and the clauses were standard. And the ketubbah, the marriage contract, thereby loses its importance as a very personal document to the bride and groom, because everybody's getting the same contract, the same amounts of monies. And interestingly, we don't find decorated marriage contracts of Jews from this community because it's not a highly could have valued personal document. It's an important document. You needed it in case, the bride, the wife had to appear and say, if you're divorcing me, this is what you promised. Or if she appears to the family of the groom and say who's died and says, this is what I'm owed. But it's not a personal document in the same way that it is in the communities from Spain, from the Ottoman Empire, from North Africa, where they didn't adopt a standardized text. So every single ketubah is quite personal in terms of the monies, in terms of the stipulations to that particular couple. Okay? So this decorative program, and that's, I think, one of the motifs that leads to this sort of flourishing of decoration, because it's particular, it's personal to every couple, and all of these stipulations are specific. They're also taking the trouble to embellish it. Not only that, but it's being read at a very public event. And there was a custom, there was a contemporary practice in Italy especially. We find that many legal texts and honorary documents, the medical licenses in the general population are illustrated. The legal documents are decorated as well. So it's not that surprising that the Jews were also embellishing their legal contracts in these kind of very elaborate ways. So what do we have here? Number one, we have the architectural framework. So that's, I guess, my tie-in to the sponsors, the people who dedicated this lecture as professors of architecture. Many, many, many ketubot, I'd say the vast majority of them, include architectural elements within the ketubah. Okay, that's the way in which these documents are framed. And the reason for that is probably that the Jews, this couple is entering into a new moment in their life. They're creating a new household, and the architectural imagery reflects that particular movement into a new stage, into a new household. Also floral motifs. You see a lot of floral motifs on ketubot, probably representative of the paradisial images. You also have a very intricate love knot up here, sort of above center, right above the text, that has no beginning and no end. And this is actually a motif that's been borrowed from Italian folk culture that the Jews in Italy have imported into their ketubot. But the idea of a love with no beginning and no end is, of course, quite appropriate to a ketubah. Oh, dear. How do I make that go away? No. Any idea? Yeah. Next. Did I hit that? Should I click that? No. Double click? Okay, someone's going to come and help me. In the meanwhile, oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay. So here you see a bit of a close-up of the center of the text. And another element that you see here on the four corners, you see? All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I've brought close-ups, are four implements from the ancient temple in Jerusalem. And you have the laver and pitcher going from right to left, the menorah, right, the candelabrum, the Ark of the Covenant, and the table of the showbread. And these are prominently placed in the four corners of this ketubah. There's a concept in sort of Judaism that one is meant to keep Jerusalem, place Jerusalem above one's chiefest joy. And of course, marriage is the celebration of a wedding of a couple, could certainly be considered a very important and joyous occasion. And we actually find many marriage contracts with the image of Jerusalem on top, image of the city, walled city of Jerusalem on top. This particular one does not have the image of Jerusalem, but by representing imagery of the ancient temple in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is sort of on the page. It's there. You know, you're keeping it within your mindset as part of your wedding festivities. Additionally, these implements are probably expressing a wish for the messianic redemption, because as a couple sets up their household, one anticipates that they will build their new home modeled on the principles of religion as expressed through the holiest place that had been, normally the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So, it works on many levels. On the one hand, the idea of keeping Jerusalem in mind, and on the other hand, reminding the couple that they're to build their home on the basis of the foundations of religion. The floral border contains 12 signs of the zodiac, and I'm referring to this border here. And I've blown it up for you here, and you can see some of them. That's the Scorpion over here, and Libra, and Sagittarius, and the Twins, and so that's the Crab up there, and Taurus, and they're sort of Pisces is on top there, right? So these are all 12 signs of the zodiac are here, and the zodiac was an extremely popular motif in Italian ketubbot. And one might wonder, what is the connection of the signs of the zodiac to marriage? And one could understand if one or two of the zodiacal images were included on a contract, one for the bride and one for the groom. But why is it such a feature to include all 12 on contracts? And it's a play, because the Hebrew word for zodiac is mazal. A sign of the zodiac. Mazalot is the plural, and mazal is the singular. So the full assemblage of 12 signs of the zodiac functioned as a visual expression of the good wishes extended to the couple, that they be blessed by the heavens, namely the mazalot, the zodiac, and the hope that their wedding and subsequently their marriage be under a good sign. That these images then are the visual representation of the Hebrew term mazel tov. Okay? When people say mazel tov today and they think about it as congratulations, they don't actually think about it as may the stars align and may your marriage be an auspicious one. But that's in fact what was going on in these documents. I sort of call it the pre-antibiotics age, right? People needed to do everything they could to make sure that life, went on without hitches. Nowadays, you develop strep. Well, you develop stress for sure, but you have a strep throat. You go to the doctor, you get antibiotics, and you're fine. But in those days, one could die from a strep throat. And in fact, we do know that many medical procedures were only done on certain days of the month, depending on which days were the most propitious ones as the stars aligned up properly. So this idea of mazel tov, of may the stars align, features very prominently on these ketubbot. This marriage contract from Mantua, 1737, provides us with some very interesting historical information. I had mentioned that earlier, in the medieval and Renaissance periods, the Jews were not allowed into the guilds, and consequently, most scholars believe that the majority of artwork illustrating Hebrew texts in Italy was done by Christian artists who worked to some degree under the supervision of the Jewish scribe or patron. In contrast to this, by the 18th century, we have more evidence of Jews who were able to work in the arts, and as such, it would seem that these marriage contracts, decorated in a colorful but relatively unsophisticated style, were primarily the work of Jewish artists. Not every last one, because we're going to see an exception to that in the next example, but most of them. And this ketubbah, this marriage contract, is one of the few examples where we have a clue, because it's actually signed by the scribe and artist Abraham Elijah, the son of Eliezer Fano. And this is, as far as I know, the only known signed Italian contract, and his name is down here in this, what looks like sort of scribble scrabble, but he actually signs his name that he wrote and illustrated this contract. I'd like to contrast that with this marriage contract from Mantua from 1689 that was almost certainly illustrated by a Christian as will become clear when we look at the imagery. Now, what you're looking at here is an engraved border, right? This is all engraved, and then has a handwritten text that's been written onto the parchment after the engraving was placed there. So the engraved border of this ketubah incorporates 27 biblical episodes, and on top you see Adam and Eve, the first wedded couple, reclining beneath the tree of knowledge. Okay? And the imagery starts right on top in the rondelles next to Adam and Eve. And so here you see an example of that. I'm not sure how one goes back, but over here we see some very surprising imagery. The ovals to the right and left contain depictions of God in human form. Over here, God creating the sun, the moon, and the stars. Over here, God breathing life into Adam. And over here, God anthropomorphized, bringing Eve to life from Adam's rib. And this imagery actually is in direct contradiction to the rabbis who drew this from the second commandment, which prohibits divine representation. In other words, the image of God, they feared, could lead to worship and idolatry, and therefore Judaism prohibits any kind of representation of the divine. So that's kind of surprising to find it here on a religious document. Some other surprising imagery, we find here, continue up on top. I've drawn some more highlights. God speaking to Adam and Eve, asking them what exactly they were thinking by eating from the tree. They've being expelled from the garden, and Adam and Eve working the land after their expulsion. Other biblical scenes, including some that you might not expect to find on a marriage contract. Over here, Joseph fleeing from Potiphar's bed as she's grabbing onto his cloak. And over here, Delilah cutting the hair of Samson, which will, of course, eventually result in his downfall. Even more surprising are some images that I'll show you close-ups of. They run across the bottom over here. All right. So beginning on the left-hand side, up top there, Lot and his two daughters. All right. After Sodom was destroyed, Lot's daughters decide they need to continue the world and do so by becoming impregnated by their father. An image of David spying on Bathsheba as she's bathing. An image of Susanna and the elders, right, from the apocryphal book. And somewhat inexplicably next to that, an image of the binding of Isaac, where an angel tells Abraham not to go ahead with the actual sacrifice. The artist of this ketubah, clearly of this design actually, had a strong interest in the depiction of the power of women over men, as well as in illicit relationships in the Bible and their consequences. What I wanted to point out is that Susanna and the Elders is a story that is popular in Christian tradition and Christian art, but it is not at all well known to Jews because it didn't make it into the canon of the Jewish Bible, of the Old Testament, and it's part of the apocryphal literature. And it's likely between the unusual composition and the selection of episodes and motif, which include the depiction of God in human form, that the artist of this engraved border was a Christian. But again, Jews are willing to use this artwork for a religious document, which was used at one of the most important instances of a couple's life. And we know actually that it is an engraved document. There were 5, pre-war, before World War II, there were 5 extant examples where we knew that this engraved border was used as a ketubah, beginning in the year 1689, this one here, 1690, 1693, and 1706. I think 2 were in 1690, actually, for a total of 5. So we know that the Jews were quite comfortable using imagery that was A, forbidden, and B, somewhat risque as part of a religious ceremony. And you might ask, what did the rabbis have to say about this? You know, were they on board? Were they not on board? Was this something that was being done against their wishes? And the answer is that the rabbis actually signed on literally to this document because the rabbis were the witnesses. The chief rabbi of Mantua, Rabbi Judah Briel, and the head of the rabbinical court, Chaim Nortzi, in Mantua, were the signatories to this document. So apparently, you know, in Italy, certainly in the late 17th and early 18th century, this kind of imagery, which one wouldn't expect to find, was something that the Jews were employing in their work. And we do, in fact, know that the Jews were working both creating their own ketubbot and art documents, but also we have examples where the Jews asked the Christian artists who were a little bit more sophisticated to create frontispieces and illustrations for their Bibles and Esther scrolls that were being printed at the time. Throughout history, as I said earlier, the Jews adapted the art of the host country in which they lived, and when they were living in Italy and putti were sort of all the rage in Baroque art, the Jews were using that as well. For the final part of this lecture, I wanted to explore two examples of marriage contracts where the Jewish artists were actually incorporating secular imagery into the decorative program. And you're looking at here at a ketubbah, a marriage contract from Rome from 1836. And we see a very common decorative motif found in marriage contracts from Rome specifically, and that is the adaptation of allegorical imagery that was popular throughout Christian Europe in the 17th and 18th century. What was going on? Christian artists produced guidebooks which presented a repertoire of allegories depicting vices and virtues, emotions, and moral and intellectual values. And the most popular of these guidebooks was a volume entitled Iconologia, which was created by Cesare Ripa and first published in Rome in 1593 and then reprinted continuously with engraving. And what that did was it allowed the artist to say, okay, I'd like to show love. Well, this is how do you show love? What do you do when you're creating these symbols? And these guidebooks had hundreds of images, both vices and virtues. You want to show sloth? Well, here's what it is. You want to show hope? Here's how you do it. So if you look, I have close-ups, but look on either side, you see those two women in the border. And these two allegorical female figures in the center provide an excellent example. In the right border is Vittoria, that's victory, and she's holding a branch and a crown. And in an attempt to Judaicize this secular allegory, which is not apparently associated with marriage, the scribe has added explanatory verses which do not allude to the general meaning of the figure of victory, but rather to the attributes she carries. So she's got probably an olive branch, right, as the branch and a crown, and you see these added texts, and those texts are as follows. The texts are from Psalms 37:11. It says, "And she delights in an abundance of peace," because peace, an olive branch, typically symbolizes peace. So peace, obviously, is a symbol that one might want in a marriage. Victory, not so much. You know, it is not to be victorious all the time, I'm told. But peace, yes. And on the crown in her left is alluded to with words from Proverbs, which is, "They'll crown you with a glorious diadem." So this idea of the Jews who marry are sometimes compared, are always compared, to a bride, to a king and a queen, right? On your wedding day, the bride and groom are compared to a king and queen. So this idea of being crowned at the moment of the wedding might be what's going on over there. The left niche that you see on the left here houses Speranza, that's hope, and she's shown as a woman holding on to a large black anchor, which is the symbol of hope and safety. You can see the anchor over there. And again here, words from the Bible on top. which again from Proverbs 14. Fear of the Lord is a stronghold, and the idea of sort of founding your marriage with the basis of belief and fear of God, right? Miftach is a stronghold. And this is a ketubbot from Rome from 1763. And here, above the text, a man and a woman are linked with a gold chain. And I'll have a close-up of that. But you can see this sort of wonderful imagery of the heralding trumpets, angels with trumpets on top, and the cornucopia, so the fullness, and the architectural imagery, the columns with wreaths surrounding them, swirling around them, and sort of the text from the Bible, all on the border. They've sort of moved out from right up close to the actual text of the marriage contract and moved out to the border. And on top is this very interesting image. And a man and a woman are linked with a golden chain around their necks, to which is attached a heart-shaped pendant. I'll show you a close-up of that. Okay. And this heart-shaped pendant is actually, this sort of chain with the links between the bride and the groom, is a symbol of a harmonious marriage. And it's actually the image of Concordia Materiale, borrowed from a popular Christian use. This image actually embodies the Catholic concept of marriage, namely that the husband and wife are but one body and can only be separated by death. This is not actually a Jewish concept because in Judaism, divorce is an option. It's a valid option. Marriage is not working out. There are rules and regulations, but you can get divorced. It's not a problem. And go on and do something different. So this idea of a marriage that can only be dissolved by death is quite Christian, and the Jews seem to be borrowing even this religious concept for their particular marriage, Jewish marriage contracts. And one final feature I'll show you about these contracts, because we have it in close-up over here. It appeared in some of the others, but it was a little small, is this idea of coats of arms. In continuation of what I was referring to earlier, where these documents are quite specific to the families, and the families maybe are sort of showing off a little bit about how much money they can spend embellishing these legal contracts, which again will not be hung on a wall. These were rolled up, tied with a ribbon, and kept in a safe place in case the wife ever needed resource to it. So they were spending quite a bit of money, and the Jews of Italy were very proud of their heritage, and what they did was they created their own coats of arms. So they weren't granted family emblems by the ruling authorities, but rather they created their own, and they passed these down for generations. And what you're seeing on top here in this marriage contract, almost seeing, could be seeing, I know I'm at the end of my time. I was just finishing with this. What you will be seeing in a minute, did I do something? Okay, are two coats of arms in the top shields. One of them is the coat of arms of the groom, Cayente, and the other is the coat of arms of the bride, the De Castro family. And maybe we'll sort of get that back and we'll be able to see it. And these often involved lions and palm branches and towers, and sometimes they were plays on the name of the bride and the groom. And when we do get it back, you'll see that one is a lion with a tower, and the other is a lion with a palm branch. And I think it's another way of personalizing these documents and showing the importance of the families. So with this, we've had the opportunity to look at the celebration of Jewish marriage as visually recorded in a selection of magnificent Hebrew manuscripts from the Renaissance period, and also examine the art and history of sumptuously decorated Italian marriage documents. And these manuscripts afford us a glimpse into the world of the aristocratic Italian Jewish families and allow us to share in the artistic creativity of the patrons and the scribes of the artists. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'm happy to take them if there's time, and if not, everybody's waited a while and, can all go home. But sure, go ahead.
Do you have information on the less wealthy marriage contracts?
Yes, I meant to make that point. Thank you for bringing it up. So what's going on is, I should point out that 98%, 99% of all marriage contracts going on were not decorated. Okay, they weren't decorated because you don't need it to be decorated in order to celebrate a Jewish marriage. You just need the text. But because they weren't decorated, they weren't valued, and so we don't have all that many of them. Let's say from Italy from this particular period, the ones that were kept around from the 17 and 1800s and the 1900s were the decorated ones. So we do have undecorated contracts going back to the 11th and 12th century from the Cairo Geniza, and there's been quite a bit of research. There's a book on Jewish marriage by Friedman, who wrote about these specifically, and one can see them, but the ones that were maintained in the libraries tend to be the decorated ones, and as an art historian, that's what I focused on, because they have both the text and the images. So that's not to say that they're not important. They are important, but there are many more of the decorated ones around today than they are it's just what remained. So that sort of by way of answer. For those of you who are interested in pursuing marriage contracts a little bit more, there's a website. There's several websites that you can go to. The National Library in Israel is about to relaunch a website where they've brought together about 3,000 of these marriage contracts. It should be launched in the next month or two. It's there, but it's not in English yet. And that's the National Library of Israel. And you put the word National Library, ketubbot in, and ketubbot, and this should come up pretty soon. The Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary has a website. And also the Braginsky collection has a wonderful website online with both manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, and with marriage contracts that you can sort of go and look and blow up. And that's, I think that's under Braginsky Collection, Braginsky collection, oneword.com. So there are resources to explore, and if anybody wants to follow this up further, you're welcome to ask me afterwards.
So I think of the ketubah as something which is particularly Jewish, but are there Christian equivalents?
We don't, but that's a good question. I probably should have mentioned that too. There are examples of marriage contracts in Islamic lands. We do have, and we have decorated Islamic contracts. And what's interesting, if we had the time, which we didn't, is to see the way in which the Jewish contracts from Islamic lands, Iraq and Iran, mirror the Islamic decorated contracts of the time. As far as I know, the concept of decorated Christian contracts doesn't exist in this period. And in fact, about 2 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times about how some fundamentalist Christians liked the idea of Jewish marriage contracts and were sort of expropriating that and taking it back into their religion, which led me to think that probably, and maybe someone in the audience knows more, but as far as I know, we have other kinds of legal contracts that get decorated within the Christian culture in Europe, but not marriage licenses as far as I know. Sure.
Are the contracts today different from this? We have seen about decorations like this for.
So that's a good question. What happened is, in the end of the 19th century, the phenomena of decorating these marriage contracts dies out in Western Europe. It keeps going in the Orient, in Iraq and Iran, in sort of Asia and Africa, North Africa, but we don't have it as much in Italy. The Jews are assimilating, they're on the move, and then World War I and World War II kill it off completely. I mean, nobody has the time or energy or money or stability to think about commissioning this kind of lavish document. So there's some printed documents that get done, but mostly it's text, just text. The rabbi has it. You go to the rabbi, you get married, he gives you the text, and they just fill in the name of the bride and groom, and printers print these up. In the 70s, there was a kind of a whole earth movement in America generally, and in Judaism as well. And Jews were kind of exploring their traditions. They were knitting their own skull caps, their ketubbot. They were weaving their own prayer shawls, and they were creating their own marriage contracts. And as a result, the 70s witnessed this revival of the art of decorated marriage contracts. And so nowadays, from the 70s onwards, and particularly in the 80s, it became very popular for Jewish couples to commission artists to create their own contracts. And so if you have enough time and money, usually artists require at least about 3 months in order to create one for you nowadays. And they go for about $2,000-3,000 is the going rate for one of these. You'll commission it, but otherwise artists have created lithographic borders with the printed text, and with the advent of the computer age, you can kind of customize the text a little bit. You could do the Orthodox text inside with this lithographic border, or the Reform, or whichever one you might like. So yes, we have it, and this art form does continue today, but there was a gap in the middle. It's not a straightforward continuity. It kind of stopped and then was revived as part of what was going on. And here were the coats of arms I was talking to you about beforehand of the bride, of the groom and the bride on either side. So thank you very much for setting that back up again. Any other questions? No. Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.